6 generations of my family have worked these fields, but nothing prepared me for what my tractor uncovered buried beneath that old oak grove from the Civil War era. I broke into a chamber that had been sealed for over 150 years, and what I discovered inside didn't just reveal a forgotten chapter of history. It challenged everything we thought we knew about our nation's past. And then the historians and collectors came, determined to claim my discovery as their own. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because next week I'll show you something from that chamber that I haven't revealed to anyone else. I'm Jackson Merritt, 6th-generation farmer on this 120-acre piece of land my ancestors settled back in 1843, just outside of Willow Creek, Missouri. My family has worked this soil through Civil War battles, Reconstruction hardships, 2 world wars, and countless personal struggles. The Merritt Farm has survived it all, until now. These days, family farms like mine are becoming endangered species, squeezed between massive industrial operations, climate change, and relentless suburban development that's swallowing up agricultural land at an alarming rate. Last spring, I was facing the grim reality that I might be the last Merritt to work this soil. 4 consecutive years of extreme weather patterns had decimated my crops. First came the flooding that washed away half my corn before it could even take root. Then, the unexpected early frost that killed my soybeans. The next year brought a drought so severe it cracked the earth like an old china plate. No matter what I planted or how I timed it, Mother Nature seemed determined to break my spirit along with my bank account. Every morning, I'd check my mailbox with a sense of dread. The bank was sending increasingly threatening letters about foreclosure, each one more official and final than the last. The most recent notice gave me just 90 days to make good on my payments or lose everything. Meanwhile, Heritage Developments, the real estate corporation buying up struggling farms throughout the county to build luxury subdivisions they ironically name after the farms they destroy, had already made 3 offers on my property. Each offer was higher than the last, as if they could smell my desperation growing. The latest envelope contained architectural renderings of what they called Merritt Estates. 100 cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns where generations of my family had cultivated crops. Just seeing my family name on their glossy brochure made my stomach turn. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me that my farm was failing, despite being situated on what was once considered some of the most historically significant land in the state. My great-grandmother Martha used to sit on the porch swing on summer evenings, pointing toward the rolling hills to the east, as she told me stories about how this property had once been a crucial waypoint during the Civil War. According to her, it was a place where both Union and Confederate soldiers had passed through, some finding temporary sanctuary, others never leaving again. "This land remembers, Jackson," she would tell me, her eyes distant as if seeing ghosts walking across our fields. "The soil holds memories of every footstep, every tear, every drop of blood that fell upon it." Those stories seemed like distant legends now as I looked out at my struggling fields, wondering how many more harvests, if any, I had left before the bulldozers came for my heritage too. Modern farming methods had changed everything. The introduction of genetically modified crops resistant to specific herbicides had transformed agriculture, but it also created a dependency on expensive proprietary seeds and chemicals that small farmers like me struggled to afford. Market demands constantly shifted, favoring large operations that could quickly adapt. Rising fuel costs, aging equipment, and increasingly unpredictable weather patterns had slowly stripped the connection between my family and this land. The soil that had sustained my ancestors through the nation's most turbulent times now seemed to be giving up on me, or perhaps I was giving up on it. Each morning I found it harder to pull on my boots and face another day of fighting what increasingly felt like a losing battle. My neighbor, Frank Thornton, had already surrendered to the inevitable. His family's farm had stood alongside ours for nearly as long, 175 years of shared borders, shared equipment, shared struggles. Just last month, I'd watched him sign the final paperwork, transferring his property to Heritage Developments, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he surrendered. His family legacy for a sum that probably wouldn't last him a decade. The bulldozers arrived the very next day, uprooting century-old hickory trees and tearing down the farmhouse his grandfather had built by hand after returning from World War I. I stood at our property line watching as they erased generations of Thornton history in a single afternoon. "You can't stop progress, Jack," Frank had told me later that evening, not meeting my eyes as we shared a somber beer on my porch. His voice held the hollow resignation of a man trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. Farming's a losing game these days. The big operations and developers have already won. Take the money while they're still offering it. At least then something of your family's work survives. Maybe he was right. Maybe small farmers like us were just stubborn relics, clinging to an outdated way of life in a world that had moved on. The heritage offer sitting on my kitchen table represented more money than I'd ever see from farming. It could pay for my kids' college education, fund a comfortable retirement, perhaps even buy a smaller place somewhere else. But every time I picked up the phone to call them back, I could almost hear my great-grandmother Martha's voice echoing across the decades. "This land doesn't just grow crops, Jackson. It grows stories. And some stories aren't finished telling themselves yet." I was desperate for a solution, any solution. The foreclosure date was just 3 months away, and I didn't have nearly enough to make the payment. The crop insurance wouldn't cover half my losses from last season's early frost, and equipment repairs had drained what little savings I had left. The tractor was making an ominous knocking sound that I couldn't afford to have diagnosed. The irrigation system needed updating. The barn roof had started leaking. Each day brought a new problem I lacked the resources to fix. Something had to change, or this would be the last spring a Merritt planted these fields. That's when I remembered my great-grandmother's stories about the soldier's rest that was supposedly hidden somewhere on our property. As a child, I'd assumed it was just another tall tale, like her stories about ghost soldiers patrolling the North Field on foggy nights, or the phantom sounds of battle that could supposedly be heard on the anniversary of nearby skirmishes. Great-grandma Martha would describe how her grandfather, my great-great-great-grandfather Samuel Merritt, had constructed a hidden chamber during the Civil War. "The old man was walking a dangerous line," she would say in a hushed voice, even decades after any danger had passed, helping men from both sides when they needed it most. Some came through in the night, some stayed longer, some never left at all. According to family legend, Samuel had created some kind of underground shelter, a place to hide escaped slaves traveling the Underground Railroad, wounded soldiers from both armies, and valuable supplies that neither side could afford to lose. Missouri had been a particularly dangerous place during the war, a border state where loyalties were divided and neighbors often fought on opposite sides. Being caught helping either side could mean death, yet allegedly my ancestor had helped both. After the war ended, he'd supposedly sealed up this chamber, telling his children it should remain closed until the country remembers what we fought for. No one in living memory had ever found this mythical place, and most of the family had written it off as just another colorful exaggeration from our family's past. With nothing to lose but a few hours of time I probably should have spent fixing irrigation lines, I decided to see if there was any truth to these old stories. What I didn't expect was how that decision would unearth not just a physical chamber, but long-buried secrets that would change everything. For me, for this farm, and for our understanding of a pivotal moment in American history. That night, I found myself in our farmhouse attic, surrounded by generations of family artifacts. The air was thick with dust and memories, heavy with the weight of time. Ancient trunks and weathered furniture crowded beneath the sloped ceiling, each piece holding silent witness to my family's history. I hadn't been up here in years, not since my father passed away, and I inherited both the farm and its burdens. I came looking for anything that might shed light on Great-Grandma Martha's stories about the Soldiers' Rest. If such a place truly existed, there had to be some record of it, some clue to its location beyond fading oral traditions. And in the far corner sat my great-grandmother's hope chest, its oak surface dulled by a century of handling. I remembered how she'd let me peek inside as a child, showing me treasures she claimed were only valuable to those who knew their stories. Back then, I was more interested in playing outside than listening to an old woman's tales. Now I desperately wished I'd paid more attention. The chest's brass hinges creaked in protest as I lifted the lid, releasing the scent of cedar and lavender. Inside lay neatly folded quilts, yellowed lace handkerchiefs, and bundles of letters, tied with faded ribbons. Beneath these, I found a small, leather-bound book, my great-grandmother's journal, its pages brittle and browned at the edges. As I carefully turned the delicate pages, I realized this wasn't just any diary. It contained stories her grandfather, Samuel Merritt, had told her, recorded in her precise handwriting. Stories about the war, about the farm, about the terrible choices made in desperate times. Most importantly, there were specific references to the hidden chamber. Grandfather told me today about the sanctuary beneath the Twin Oaks. One entry from 1923 read, "Said he sealed it after Appomattox, when the fighting officially ended, but the hatred hadn't. Said it contained things the world wasn't ready to understand yet. When I asked when it should be opened, he said, when the nation truly needs to remember what happens when we see each other as enemies rather than brothers." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the attic's drafty windows. The Twin Oaks, I knew exactly where they were, or rather where they had been. Two massive oak trees had once stood in the eastern section of our property, marking what my father had always called the Divide, a subtle ridge that ran north to south across our land. One tree had fallen during a storm in the 1950s, according to my father. The other had been struck by lightning when I was a teenager, leaving only a massive stump that we'd never fully removed because the equipment kept breaking whenever we tried. Another entry caught my eye, dated July 2nd, 1924. Grandfather showed me the marker today, said if anything ever happened to the oaks, this would point the way. A simple stone, set at the midpoint between them, carved with a compass star. He made me swear never to mention it to outsiders. "Some secrets need to stay buried until healing can come from their revelation," he said. The journal contained other, cryptic references, measurements taken from the old well to the marker stone, mentions of a false floor and counterweighted door, lists of supplies stored within the chamber, including medical items, preserved food, ammunition, and what Martha enigmatically called the papers and proofs. Most intriguing was a hand-drawn map tucked between the pages, showing the eastern section of the farm as it had looked during the 1860s. The Twin Oaks were clearly marked, along with several other landmarks, many of which no longer existed. A dotted line connected various points, forming what appeared to be a path through the property, ending at a spot between the oaks marked with a small X. As I studied these materials, my great-grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from the pages. These weren't just stories meant to entertain a child on summer evenings. They were deliberately preserved clues, passed down through generations, waiting for someone who might need them. Waiting, perhaps, for a moment when the farm itself needed saving. I spent hours in that attic, piecing together fragments of information from the journal, old letters and family photographs. What emerged was a picture far more complex than I'd imagined. Samuel Merritt hadn't been simply a farmer trying to survive the war. According to these records, he'd been actively involved in a dangerous operation that served both sides of the conflict, while simultaneously supporting the Underground Railroad. Missouri's position as a border state had made it particularly volatile during the Civil War. Officially remaining in the Union, but with strong Southern sympathies in many areas, it saw some of the conflict's most brutal guerrilla warfare. Neighbor turned against neighbor, and family loyalties were violently divided. Within this chaos, my ancestor had apparently created a space of neutrality, a literal underground sanctuary where the wounded could heal regardless of their uniforms, color, and where escaped slaves could rest safely on their journey north. One letter, written by Samuel himself and addressed to his son, was particularly revealing. What I have done, I did not do for glory or recognition, but because I could not turn away from suffering, regardless of its source. Some will call me a traitor to both sides. Perhaps I am. But I answer to a higher loyalty than any flag can claim. The more I read, the more I began to understand why Samuel had sealed the chamber after the war. It contained evidence of actions that would have been considered treasonous by both North and South, helping deserters, hiding escaping slaves, providing medical aid to enemy soldiers. Such revelations could have brought violent reprisals against his family in the war's aftermath, when bitterness and recrimination still ran high. But there was something else, something mentioned repeatedly, but never fully explained. References to the documents, the truth that cannot yet be told, and evidence that would rewrite history. Whatever these items were, Samuel had considered them important enough to preserve, but dangerous enough to conceal. As midnight approached, I found myself surrounded by piles of family history, my mind racing with possibilities. If the chamber existed, if it had remained sealed and undisturbed for over 150 years, what condition would its contents be in? Could there truly be, historically, significant artifacts preserved inside? And if so, what would they be worth? That last question gave me pause. I wasn't thinking about historical value or national significance. I was calculating potential financial value. The shameful thought crossed my mind that perhaps whatever lay hidden in this chamber could save the farm from foreclosure. Artifacts that could be sold to museums or private collectors for enough to clear my debts. I immediately felt a stab of guilt. My ancestor had hidden these items to protect them and his family, not so they could be sold off by a desperate descendant 6 generations later. Yet what choice did I have? The farm would be lost regardless if I couldn't make the mortgage payments. At least this way, I might preserve the land itself, even if I had to sacrifice whatever history lay beneath it. With this uncomfortable rationalization, I carefully returned the journal and papers to the hope chest, except for the map, which I tucked into my pocket. Tomorrow, I decided, I would search for the marker stone between the fallen oak trees. If Great-Grandma Martha's records were accurate, it might lead me to the hidden chamber. If not, I'd have wasted a day I couldn't spare on a wild goose chase, born of desperation. As I turned off the attic light, a strange feeling settled over me, the sense that I was being watched by unseen eyes. Not in a threatening way, but as if the past itself was observing my actions, judging my intentions. I told myself it was just exhaustion combined with too many hours spent among the relics of the dead. Back in my bedroom, I placed the fragile map on my nightstand and tried to sleep. But my dreams were filled with Civil War soldiers moving through my fields, their uniforms both blue and gray, their faces bearing my family's features. They seemed to be searching for something, or perhaps warning me about what I was about to find. I awoke at dawn, the map still beside me, my mind made up. Historical guilt and ghostly warnings aside, I needed to know if the chamber existed. The farm's survival might depend on it. Within the hour, I was on my old tractor, headed toward the eastern ridge, where the twin oaks had once stood sentinel over whatever secrets lay beneath them. What I couldn't know then was that breaking the seal on that long-hidden chamber wouldn't just potentially save my farm. It would unearth truths that powerful people had worked for generations to keep buried, triggering a battle for ownership of history itself. The eastern section of our farm had always been different from the rest, less fertile, more rocky, with subtle undulations in the landscape that made it difficult to plough. My father had primarily used it for grazing, and in recent years I'd let much of it grow wild, focusing my limited resources on the more productive western fields. As I guided my tractor along the overgrown path, tall grasses whipped against. The wheel wells and young saplings had to be navigated around. Nature had been reclaiming this area, almost as if it were protecting something. The morning sun cast long shadows across the land as I approached the ridge my father had called the Divide. According to the map, the twin oaks had stood on this natural elevation, positioned like sentinels overlooking the rest of the property. Only the massive stump of the second tree remained visible now, a decaying monument to the lightning strike that had felled it 15 years ago. I parked the tractor and continued on foot, the old map clutched in my hand. The paper had grown even more fragile in the morning humidity, forcing me to handle it with extreme care. Looking from the map to the landscape and back again, I tried to reconcile what my great-grandmother had documented with what now existed. The contours of the land remained largely the same, but trees had grown where once there were clearings, and what had been described as a small pond was now just a marshy depression. According to the map, the marker stone should be at the midpoint between where the two oak trees had stood. I knew where one tree had been. Its stump was unmistakable, but the location of the first tree, fallen decades earlier, was less certain. Using the distances noted in Martha's journal and the landmarks that still remained, I began to triangulate. Where it must have been, after nearly an hour of careful measurements and educated guesses, I identified a slight depression in the ground approximately 50 yards from the stump. This, I suspected, was where the root ball of the first oak had been, gradually decomposing after the tree fell in the 1950s. If I was right, the marker stone would be somewhere between these 2 points. I began walking a careful line between the stump and the depression, my eyes scanning the ground. Years of fallen leaves, soil accumulation, and plant growth would have obscured any surface feature. The marker stone, if it existed, could be buried beneath inches or even feet of soil after 150 years. The minutes stretched into another hour as I methodically searched, occasionally dropping to my knees to investigate promising shapes in the earth. The sun climbed higher, and sweat soaked through my shirt. I was beginning to question the entire enterprise when my boot struck something solid that didn't feel like the other rocks in the area. I dropped down and began clearing away the surrounding soil with my hands. What emerged was unmistakably intentional, a roughly rectangular stone about the size of a small loaf of bread, smoothed on its upper surface. As I brushed away more dirt, I could make out faint scratches that formed a simple 8-pointed star. This was it, the compass marker my great-grandmother had described. My pulse quickened as I fully uncovered the stone, revealing not just the star symbol, but underneath it, a crude arrow pointing due east. According to the journal, the stone was just a marker, not the entrance itself. It pointed the way, rather than marking the exact spot. I oriented myself and began walking east, carefully counting my paces as indicated in the journal. 23 steps from the star to the sanctuary. At what I judged to be 23 paces, I found myself in a slight natural depression between 2 rocky outcroppings. Nothing obvious indicated an entrance, but the journal had mentioned a false floor and counterweighted door. I began a careful inspection of the ground, tapping with a fallen branch to test for hollow sounds, probing the soil for any unusual resistance. The temperature was climbing, and doubt began to creep back into my thoughts. What if the entrance had collapsed long ago? What if natural soil movement had sealed it permanently? Or worse, what if this was all just an elaborate family myth, and I was wasting precious time that should be spent trying to save the farm through more practical means? Just as I was about to give up, my branch struck something that produced a distinctly different sound, not the dull thud of earth, but a hollow, almost metallic resonance. Dropping to my knees again, I began clearing away the thin layer of soil, revealing what appeared to be a flat piece of rusted metal about 3 feet across. Excitement surged through me as I worked faster, exposing what was unmistakably a trapdoor, set into the ground. Its surface was covered with a layer of soil and plant growth that had accumulated over decades, rendering it nearly invisible to casual observation. Around its edges, I could make out the remnants of timber framing that had once supported and concealed it, now largely rotted away. At the edge of the metal door was a recessed handle, so corroded that it almost blended into the surrounding surface. I grasped it and pulled, but years of rust and soil had effectively sealed the door shut. I returned to the tractor and retrieved a crowbar and shovel from my toolbox, then set to work properly clearing the door's edges and applying leverage to break the decades of rust that held it fast. For nearly 30 minutes I struggled, sweat pouring down my face, hands blistering despite my work gloves. The door resisted stubbornly, as if reluctant to give up its secrets after so many years of faithful guardianship. Finally, with a protesting groan of metal that hadn't moved since the 19th century, the door shifted slightly. Encouraged, I redoubled my efforts, working the crowbar around each edge until, with a sudden surrender, the door broke free from its rusted hinges and fell open. A rush of cool, stale air escaped from the darkness below, carrying with it the unmistakable musty scent of long enclosed space. I shone my flashlight into the opening, revealing a set of timber stairs descending about 8 feet into the earth. The wood appeared remarkably preserved, protected from moisture and exposure by the clever design of the entrance. My great-great-great-grandfather had been an ingenious builder. Caution temporarily overcame curiosity as I tested the first step with my weight. Despite their age, the timbers held firm. Samuel had constructed this place to last, using what appeared to be hardwood cut from the property itself. Each step creaked but supported my weight as I slowly descended into the chamber that had remained sealed for more than a century and a half. At the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight beam revealed a space larger than I had anticipated. Roughly 15 feet square, with walls reinforced by a combination of timber framing and stacked stone. The ceiling was supported by heavy oak beams, some showing signs of age, but none having failed. The floor was packed earth, dry and solid, but it was the contents of the chamber that took my breath away. Against one wall stood a row of wooden crates, their lids secured with simple iron hasps. Along another wall were shelves holding dozens of glass bottles and jars, their contents indiscernible under layers of dust. A small field desk occupied one corner, its surface covered with what appeared to be ledgers and journals bound in leather. Most remarkable of all was a large trunk positioned in the center of the room, more elaborately constructed than the simple crates, with brass fittings that had tarnished to a dull green. The air in the chamber felt charged with history, with secrets preserved in darkness for generations, waiting for someone to bring them back into the light. I moved my flashlight beam across the space again, noting other details. A small medical cabinet with a red cross painted on its door. Several military haversacks hanging from pegs. What appeared to be Union and Confederate uniform parts carefully folded on a shelf. And strangest of all, a small printing press wedged into one corner. As I stood there, overwhelmed by the discovery, a disturbing thought crossed my mind. What if this place contained human remains? The journal had mentioned that some who sought refuge here never left. With trepidation, I directed my light into each corner, half expecting to discover skeletons. To my relief, there were none immediately visible, though the numerous crates could potentially contain remains. I approached the central trunk first, drawn by its prominence in the room. The brass lock had corroded over time, and with careful application of the crowbar, it yielded with surprising ease. I lifted the heavy lid to reveal several leather-bound portfolios resting atop layers of carefully folded documents. The top portfolio bore a simple label written in faded ink, "The True Account." With trembling hands, I opened this portfolio, revealing a handwritten manuscript on pages that had yellowed but remained intact, protected from light and moisture within their sealed environment. The first page bore a date, April 18th, 1865, just days after Lincoln's assassination, and a simple title, "What History Must Not Forget." I began to read the neat, precise handwriting, and within the first few paragraphs, I understood why my ancestor had hidden these documents so carefully. They contained detailed accounts of a secret network operating in Missouri during the Civil War. Not just the Underground Railroad that helped escaped slaves, but a separate organization that assisted deserters from both armies and documented war crimes committed by both Union and Confederate forces in the border regions. Most shocking of all were the specific names mentioned, prominent historical figures from both North and South implicated in actions they had never acknowledged, alongside evidence that several well-documented historical events had unfolded very differently than official accounts claimed. If authenticated, these documents would force a significant revision of Civil War history as it pertained to Missouri and the border states. I sat on a sturdy wooden crate, manuscript in hand, as the implications began to sink in. This wasn't just a fascinating historical discovery, it was potentially explosive. The descendants of those named in these documents included some of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the state, people who had built their fortunes and reputations on carefully curated versions of their ancestors' wartime activities. My thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of a vehicle approaching on the access road. I checked my watch, surprised to find that nearly 4 hours had passed since I'd left the house. I hadn't told anyone about my search, and the farm was remote enough that unexpected visitors were rare. Quickly, I placed the manuscript back in the trunk and closed it, then made my way up the stairs. Before emerging, I paused to listen. 2 car doors slammed, followed by voices, one female, one male, that I didn't recognize. Cautiously, I climbed the remaining steps and peered out. A black SUV with government plates was parked beside my tractor. A woman in a tailored pantsuit and a man in khakis and a button-down shirt were examining the area, taking photographs of the disturbed ground around the chamber entrance. They hadn't noticed me yet. I had a split-second decision to make, reveal myself or retreat back into the chamber. The choice was made for me when the woman turned and spotted my head emerging from the ground. "Mr. Merritt," she called, her voice carrying a note of authority. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Simmons from the State Historical Society. We need to talk about what you've found." In that moment, I knew that my discovery was already attracting attention from those who might want to control. Somehow word had gotten out. The battle for the chamber and its contents had begun before I'd even fully understood what I'd uncovered. "How did you know I found something?" I asked Dr. Simmons, climbing fully out of the chamber. Dirt clung to my jeans, and my hands were raw from hours of digging and prying. Dr. Simmons exchanged a glance with her companion before answering. We monitor property records for historically significant sites. When foreclosure proceedings begin on Civil War-era properties, we're automatically notified." She gestured to the open trapdoor. "But I admit, we didn't expect to find you making such a significant discovery." The man stepped forward, extending his hand. "Dr. Marcus Reed, state archaeologist. May I ask what you found down there, Mr. Merritt?" Their explanation made sense, but something felt off. The timing was too convenient, their arrival too prompt after my discovery of the chamber. I decided to be cautious. "Just some old storage space," I said with a shrug. "My great-grandmother mentioned it in her journals. Thought there might be something valuable enough to help with the farm's finances." Dr. Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. "And was there?" "Nothing but some rotted supplies and old papers," I lied. "Probably worthless after all this time." "Those old papers could be historically significant," Dr. Simmons said. "As representatives of the State Historical Society, we'd be obligated to evaluate anything of historical value. May we take a look?" Their credentials appeared legitimate, but I'd spent enough time reading my ancestors' journals to understand the value of discretion. Samuel Merritt hadn't preserved these documents only to have them casually handed over to the first officials, who appeared. "The structure seems unstable," I said. "I was just about to secure it before heading back to call someone about properly assessing it. Safety first, right?" Dr. Simmons smiled tightly. "Of course. But as qualified professionals, we're prepared to make a preliminary assessment now. The Historical Society has protocols for such situations." I glanced at their vehicle again, noting a detail I'd missed before. A small magnetic seal on the Duca that read, "Chesterfield Historical Foundation, not the State Historical Society." The inconsistency confirmed my instinct for caution. "I appreciate your interest, but this is private property, and I haven't authorized any assessment yet. I'm sure you understand the need to follow proper procedures." I moved slightly, positioning myself between them and the chamber entrance. Dr. Reed's friendly demeanor cooled. "Mr. Merritt, I don't think you understand the legal implications here. Any artifacts of historical significance fall under state preservation statutes. Failure to report such findings could result in penalties. Then I'll be sure to report through the proper channels once I've secured the site," I replied, maintaining my position. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have farm work to attend to." The standoff lasted several uncomfortable seconds before Dr. Simmons sighed and handed me her business card. "Call us when you're ready to proceed properly. We'll be following up regardless." As they reluctantly returned to their SUV, I noticed Dr. Reed taking more photographs of the area. Only after their vehicle disappeared down my access road did I let out the breath I'd been holding. Whatever was in that chamber, it was already drawing attention from people willing to misrepresent themselves to gain access. I needed to understand what I'd found before others tried to take control of it. I descended back into the chamber, this time bringing a battery-powered lantern that illuminated the space more fully than my flashlight had. In the improved light, the contents appeared even more remarkable and more numerous than I'd initially realized. This wasn't just a simple hiding place, it was a meticulously preserved time capsule. Returning to the central trunk, I carefully removed the portfolio labeled "The True Account" and settled on a wooden crate to read it properly. The manuscript began with a personal statement from my ancestor. "I, Samuel James Merritt, being of sound mind and burdened conscience, do hereby set forth the true accounting of events in Missouri from 1861 to 1865, that future generations might know what was hidden for the protection of many, including both the innocent and the guilty." What follows is not one man's testimony, but a collected record from dozens who passed through this sanctuary, leaving their witness before continuing their journeys, some to new lives, others to their final rest. What followed was astonishing, a detailed chronicle of a secret organization called The Crossing that operated throughout Missouri during the Civil War. Unlike other underground railroad operations that primarily helped escaped slaves reach free territories, The Crossing extended its protection to deserters from both armies, civilian refugees, and individuals targeted by the irregular militias that terrorized the border regions. Most explosive were the detailed accounts of atrocities committed by units on both sides, complete with names, dates, and locations. Several prominent Missouri families, names I recognized as belonging to current political and business leaders, had ancestors implicated in these events. Some had ordered massacres of civilians. Others had profited enormously by selling supplies to both sides while feeding intelligence that led to deadly ambushes. Equally shocking were records showing that several celebrated Civil War heroes from Missouri had actively collaborated with the enemy when it suited their financial interests. Men whose statues stood in public squares had, according to these documents, secretly arranged profitable prisoner exchanges while publicly advocating for no quarter to be given. I set aside the manuscript with shaking hands, understanding now why Samuel had sealed these records. During Reconstruction and the decades that followed, such revelations could have triggered renewed violence or vigilante justice against the families named. Even today, these documents would send shockwaves through Missouri society, challenging cherished historical narratives and tarnishing legacies built on carefully sanitized versions of the past. Moving to the field desk, I found ledgers documenting the passage of over 300 individuals through the sanctuary, each entry including names, dates, and often personal effects left in the chamber. One ledger, bound in red leather, recorded the 47 people who had died while in the sanctuary's protection, most from wounds or illness that couldn't be treated with the limited medical resources available. According to Samuel's notes, these individuals were buried on the property in unmarked graves to protect their identities, a detail that sent a chill through me. My land potentially held dozens of Civil War-era burials that had remained undiscovered for generations. The wooden crates yielded further treasures. The first contained military equipment, canteens, belt buckles, buttons, and insignia from both Union and Confederate forces. Another held medical supplies, some still sealed in their original packaging, rolls of bandages, bottles of various medicinal compounds, and surgical instruments that looked primitive by modern standards. Most valuable of all was a crate containing personal effects, pocket watches, wedding rings, daguerreotype photographs, letters, diaries, and small valuables that had apparently been left by those passing through, either as payment for sanctuary or entrusted to Samuel for safekeeping until they could be reclaimed. Each item was carefully labeled with the name of its owner and the date it was deposited. It was in the corner with the printing press. I found stacks of counterfeit travel papers, military discharge documents, and identification cards for both Union and Confederate jurisdictions. Samuel had apparently been operating a sophisticated forgery operation to help people move safely through contested territories. The quality of the forgeries was remarkable, suggesting my ancestor had professional printing experience before the war. Behind the press, partially hidden by a shelf, I discovered a small iron door set into the wall. It was locked, but the key hung on a nail just above it, attached to a faded tag that read simply, "Last Resort." The lock turned with surprising ease, revealing a narrow tunnel barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, extending into darkness beyond the reach of my lantern. An escape route, I realized, a final option for those hiding in the sanctuary if the main entrance was discovered. I made a mental note to explore it later, suspecting it might emerge somewhere in the woods that bordered the eastern edge of the property. As I continued examining the chamber's contents, one particular item caught my attention. A leather portfolio, similar to the one containing the true account, but bearing a different label, the Chesterfield Conspiracy. I froze, recalling the Chesterfield Historical Foundation insignia on my visitor's vehicle. This portfolio contained documents specifically focused on the Chesterfield family, one of Missouri's most prominent dynasties, with members currently serving in state government and controlling significant business interests. According to these papers, Augustus Chesterfield, the family patriarch during the Civil War, had systematically betrayed both Union and Confederate forces, selling intelligence to whoever paid highest while maintaining a public image of steadfast Union loyalty. More damning were detailed records showing how the initial Chesterfield fortune, the foundation of their current wealth and influence, had been amassed through deliberate profiteering, including selling defective weapons to the Union Army and diverting military supplies to the black market. The documents included copies of contracts, witness testimonies, and even letters in Augustus Chesterfield's own hand, admitting to these activities. The final pages contained something even more explosive, evidence suggesting Augustus Chesterfield had been involved in a failed plot to assassinate Missouri's provisional governor in 1862, hoping to throw the state into enough chaos to profit from emergency war contracts. The plot had never been exposed, and history recorded only that a Confederate sympathizer had been apprehended while planning an unspecified attack. With growing unease, I connected the dots. The Chesterfield Historical Foundation wasn't a legitimate historical society. It was almost certainly a private organization controlled by the Chesterfield family, dedicated to protecting their historical legacy. Somehow, they had learned about the chamber and sent representatives posing as state officials to secure whatever documents it might contain before they could become public. This wasn't just about historical revision anymore. These documents contained evidence of actual crimes, even if their perpetrators were long dead. The modern Chesterfield fortune, which funded political campaigns, controlled major businesses, and exerted enormous influence over state affairs, was built on a foundation of treachery, fraud, and attempted murder. No wonder they wanted these records. I carefully returned the Chesterfield portfolio to the trunk and closed it, my mind racing. The chamber contained historical material of immense value, both scholarly and monetary, but it also held secrets that powerful people would prefer remained buried. My discovery had potentially put me in danger from forces I hadn't even considered when I began my search this morning. As the implications sank in, I heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles on the access road again, multiple vehicles this time. Approaching quickly, my visitors had returned, and apparently they'd brought reinforcements. The sound of approaching vehicles galvanized me into action. I needed to protect what I'd found until I could determine the right course of action. Quickly, I gathered the most incriminating Chesterfield documents and the ledger recording the sanctuary's occupants, tucking them into my jacket. These, at least, wouldn't fall into the wrong hands immediately. Looking around the chamber, I realized I had no way to reseal it completely. The rusted door was broken beyond quick repair. Instead, I climbed the stairs, exited, and carefully pushed the open trapdoor until it lay flat against the ground again. It wouldn't fool anyone looking closely, but it might not be immediately obvious from a distance. I scattered loose soil and leaves over it, then hurried back to my tractor. As I crested the ridge that separated the eastern section from the main part of the farm, I could see a caravan of 3 vehicles making their way up my long gravel driveway. The black SUV I'd seen earlier led the procession, followed by a white van marked Heritage Archaeological Services and an unmarked black sedan with tinted windows. I needed allies and time to think. Bypassing the house, I drove the tractor straight toward my nearest neighbor, Mike Lawson. Unlike Frank Thornton, who had sold out to the developers, Mike was third generation on his land and as stubborn about keeping it as I was. More importantly, He was an attorney who had previously helped me navigate the complexities of agricultural regulations. If anyone could help me understand the legal implications of my discovery, it would be Mike. I pulled the tractor into Mike's yard just as his front door opened. He stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, eyebrows raised at my unexpected and clearly agitated arrival. "Jack, what's got you looking like you've seen a ghost?" "Need your help, Mike." Professionally, I killed the tractor's engine, and we don't have much time. Inside Mike's kitchen, I laid out the documents I'd taken from the chamber and quickly explained my morning's discovery. His expression shifted from curious to astonished to gravely concerned as I recounted the visit from the fake Historical Society representatives and their imminent return with reinforcements. "Let me get this straight," he said, examining the Chesterfield documents with a lawyer's careful attention. "You've discovered a Civil War-era chamber on your property containing what appears to be historically significant material that implicates the Chesterfield family in various crimes and improprieties. That's about the size of it. And now, people claiming affiliation with the Chesterfield Foundation are converging on your property, presumably to secure these materials before they become public." "Exactly." Mike set down the papers and rubbed his temples. "Well, you've certainly made your Monday morning interesting, Jack." He reached for his phone. "First things first. We need to establish legitimate historical oversight before these private interests take control. I'm calling Judge Martinez. She sits on the State Historical Preservation Board and won't be intimidated by the Chesterfield name." While Mike made his call, I peered out his front window toward my property. From this vantage point, I could see the vehicles had reached my house. Several people were now spreading out across my yard, appearing to search for me. Mike's voice broke into my observations. "Judge Martinez is sending an official state preservation officer, but it'll take at least an hour for them to get here from the capital. We need to stall your visitors until then." "How do we do that legally?" "We meet them head-on," Mike said, standing and grabbing his jacket. "They're trespassing at this point, especially if they enter any structures without permission. I'll accompany you as your legal counsel and make it clear that any attempt to remove or examine materials from your property without proper authorization will result in criminal charges." "Will that work against people with Chesterfield backing?" Mike's expression hardened. "The Chesterfields may have influence, but they don't own the law. Not entirely, anyway." We drove back to my farm in Mike's truck, approaching the house to find an operation already in progress. The white van had disgorged what appeared to be excavation equipment, and several people in khaki clothing were examining the area around my house. Dr. Simmons was speaking with a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit who had emerged in from the black sedan. As we pulled up, all activity paused. Dr. Simmons approached, her professional demeanor now edged with irritation. "Mr. Merritt, your disappearance was concerning. We were about to call the authorities." "That won't be necessary," Mike interjected, stepping forward and presenting his business card. "Mike Lawson, attorney at law. I'm representing Mr. Merritt. May I ask what authority you have to conduct operations on my client's private property?" Dr. Simmons faltered momentarily before the suited man stepped forward, extending his hand with practiced charm. "Richard Chesterfield. Mr. Lawson, Chesterfield Historical Foundation." His confidence suggested he was accustomed to his name opening doors. "We're simply offering Mr. Merritt our foundation's resources to properly document and preserve any historical findings on his property. Given the impending foreclosure, we're concerned about potential historical assets being lost or damaged." Mike didn't take the offered hand. "That's remarkably considerate, Mr. Chesterfield. However, my client has already contacted the State Historical Preservation Board, who are sending official representatives. Until they arrive, no examination or removal of any materials from this property is authorized. Richard Chesterfield's smile remained fixed, but something cold flickered in his eyes. The Foundation has all necessary permits for archaeological assessment. We're merely expediting the process as a courtesy to Mr. Merritt. I'd like to see those permits, Mike replied, and I'll need verification they specifically apply to this property. While they engaged in this legal sparring, I noticed Dr. Reed and another man quietly moving away from the group, heading in the direction of the eastern ridge where the chamber was located. I caught Mike's eye and nodded slightly in their direction. Additionally, Mike continued loudly, any individuals currently exploring the property need to return immediately. This is still private land, regardless of its foreclosure status. Richard. Chesterfield made a subtle gesture and Dr. Reed reluctantly rejoined the group. The tension in the air was palpable as Chesterfield assessed this new obstacle to his plans. Mr. Merritt, he said, turning his attention to me, perhaps we could speak privately. The Foundation is prepared to make a generous offer for any historical materials you've discovered, enough perhaps to resolve your current financial difficulties. Here it was, the bribe, thinly disguised as a legitimate offer. The amount would likely be substantial, maybe even enough to save the farm. All I had to do was hand over documents that would protect the Chesterfield legacy while denying history, the truth my ancestor had sacrificed to preserve. Any historical artifacts belong to the proper authorities, I replied. I'm not in a position to sell what I don't legitimately own. An admirable sentiment, Chesterfield said, his smile never reaching his eyes, but perhaps impractical for a man 3 months from losing his family heritage. We're offering a solution that benefits everyone. Everyone, except history, I countered. Richard Chesterfield's facade of friendliness slipped momentarily. History is rarely as clear-cut as people imagine, Mr. Merritt. Narratives require curation. The Chesterfield Foundation has extensive experience ensuring historical materials are placed in proper context. You mean ensuring they're interpreted to protect your family name, I said, the words out before I could reconsider. A flash of genuine anger crossed his features before he regained composure. I see you've jumped to certain conclusions about materials you've barely had time to examine properly. Amateur historical interpretation can lead to unfortunate misunderstandings, which is exactly why the State Historical Preservation Board should handle this, Mike interjected. To ensure objective analysis, Chesterfield checked his watch with deliberate casualness. We're happy to cooperate with state authorities, of course. In the meantime, perhaps Mr. Merritt would be willing to show us exactly what he's discovered. Purely for preliminary documentation purposes. I exchanged glances with Mike, who gave a slight nod. We needed to keep them here until the official representatives arrived, and completely denying access might escalate the situation. I can show you the location, I conceded. But nothing is to be touched or removed until state officials arrive. Perfectly reasonable, Chesterfield agreed, though something in his tone suggested he had no intention of honoring these limitations once we reached the chamber. Our uneasy procession made its way toward the eastern ridge, with Mike and me leading several members of Chesterfield's team. Richard Chesterfield himself walked beside me, periodically asking questions about my family's history and how I'd learned about the chamber's existence. I provided minimal information, sensing that each detail I revealed was being filed away for potential use against me later. As we approached the site, I could see that my hasty attempt to conceal the trapdoor had been ineffective. The disturbed soil and unnatural flatness were obvious to anyone looking for signs of recent activity. Dr. Reed immediately moved toward it, camera already in hand. "This appears to be it," he announced, brushing away my scattered camouflage to reveal the metal door. Remarkable preservation of the entrance structure. Richard Chesterfield's eyes gleamed with poorly concealed eagerness. "Shall we proceed with a preliminary examination? Dr. Simmons has extensive experience with Civil War-era artifacts." Before I could respond, the sound of another vehicle approaching drew everyone's attention. A white SUV with official state government insignia was making its way up the access road, moving with determined speed. "It appears the state representatives have arrived sooner than expected," Mike observed with poorly concealed satisfaction. "We should wait for them before proceeding further." Chesterfield's jaw tightened momentarily, but he nodded with artificial graciousness. "Of course. All proper protocols should be observed." The state SUV parked nearby, and a woman in her 50s emerged. She wore practical field clothes with an official identification badge prominently displayed. "Dr. Abigail Washington, State Historical Preservation Officer," she announced, approaching our group with confident strides. "Judge Martinez briefed me on the situation. I understand we have a potentially significant Civil War-era discovery that requires proper documentation and preservation." Her gaze swept over the assembled group, lingering briefly on Richard Chesterfield. "Mr. Chesterfield, I wasn't aware your foundation had an interest in this property." "Merely offering assistance." "Dr. Washington," he replied smoothly, "the Chesterfield Foundation is always eager to support proper historical preservation." "How thoughtful," she replied with professional neutrality. "However, as this appears to be a significant discovery on private property facing foreclosure, standard protocols require official oversight from this point forward." She turned to me. "Mr. Merritt, would you be willing to show me what you've found?" As I led Dr. Washington toward the chamber entrance, I could feel Richard Chesterfield's eyes boring into my back. The first skirmish had been won. Official oversight would now complicate any attempt to simply seize or destroy the historical materials. But I harbored no illusions that the Chesterfields would abandon their efforts to protect their family legacy. This was just the beginning of what promised to be a complex battle over not just the physical artifacts, but the very narrative of history itself. And somewhere in that underground chamber lay evidence that could either save my farm or cost me everything, possibly including my life if the Chesterfields were as ruthless as their ancestor had been. Dr. Washington conducted a thorough preliminary examination of the chamber, methodically documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. Her professionalism was evident in every careful movement as she examined the space without disturbing its contents. Richard Chesterfield and his team were kept at a respectful distance, allowed to observe but not to handle anything, a restriction that clearly frustrated them. "This is extraordinary, Mr. Merritt," Dr. Washington said as she carefully examined the printing press. "A completely preserved Civil War-era sanctuary with its contents intact. In my 30 years with the Historical Preservation Office, I've never seen anything comparable." "What happens now?" I asked, watching as she gently opened one of the leather-bound ledgers. "We'll need to bring in a specialized team to properly catalogue and preserve everything," she explained. "This chamber and its contents represent a historically significant find that requires careful handling. We'll secure the site today and begin a full documentation process tomorrow." Richard Chesterfield, who had been silently observing from the chamber entrance, finally spoke. "The Chesterfield Foundation has a fully equipped mobile preservation lab in our van. We could begin the process immediately, rather than risking further deterioration." Dr. Washington didn't even look up from her examination. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Chesterfield, but standard protocol requires official state resources for initial documentation. Your foundation is welcome to apply for research access once we've completed our preliminary work." Chesterfield's jaw tightened momentarily before he forced a smile. "Of course, we're simply eager to contribute our expertise to this remarkable discovery." "Your enthusiasm is noted," Dr. Washington replied, finally turning to face him. "Though I must admit, I'm curious about how your foundation learned of this discovery so quickly. Mr. Merritt only uncovered the chamber this morning." A barely perceptible hesitation We monitor property records for historically significant sites, particularly those facing potential development. It's part of our preservation mission. How fortuitous that you were so attentive to this particular property, Dr. Washington observed, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. The tension in the chamber was palpable as these two professionals engaged. In a subtle battle beneath their cordial exchanges, I exchanged glances with Mike, who gave me a slight nod of reassurance. Dr. Washington clearly understood more about the situation than she was explicitly stating. After completing her initial assessment, Dr. Washington announced that the chamber would be temporarily sealed and placed under official protection while the proper documentation team was assembled. 2 state police officers had arrived during her examination and would remain on site to ensure the chamber's security. "Mr. Merritt, I'd like to speak with you privately about some administrative matters," Dr. Washington said, as we all climbed back to the surface. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows across the property. Richard Chesterfield stepped forward. "Before you conclude for the day, Dr. Washington, the Chesterfield Foundation would like to formally request participation in the documentation process. As the leading private historical organization in the state, we can provide resources that might not be readily available to your department. Submit your request through the proper channels, Mr. Chesterfield," she replied. "It will receive due consideration, along with any other applications for research access." His smile remained fixed, but his eyes had turned cold. "I'll have our request on the director's desk by morning. I believe Senator Harrison will be particularly interested in supporting our involvement." The name drop was deliberate. Senator Harrison was the powerful chair of the committee that controlled funding for the State Historical Preservation Office. Dr. Washington merely nodded. "I'm sure the director will give it appropriate consideration. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to discuss certain matters with Mr. Merritt." Dismissed but far from defeated, Chesterfield gathered his team and departed, though I noticed Dr. Reed lingering to take additional photographs of the surrounding area. The state officers moved to establish a perimeter around the chamber entrance, politely but firmly ensuring that all of Chesterfield's people remained at a distance. Dr. Washington, Mike and I walked toward my farmhouse, waiting until we were well out of earshot before speaking freely. "The Chesterfields moved remarkably quickly," Dr. Washington observed. "That suggests they already knew something was here, or at least strongly suspected it." "Is that unusual?" I asked. "What's unusual is their level of interest. The Chesterfield Foundation typically focuses on preserving and promoting their family's historical contributions to the state. They rarely involve themselves with general historical preservation unless it directly connects to their narrative." Mike frowned. "Suggesting they know or suspect that whatever is in that chamber might contradict their preferred historical account?" "Precisely." Dr. Washington stopped walking and turned to face me directly. "Mr. Merritt, I need to know exactly what you found in that chamber before the Chesterfields arrived. Not what you showed me during the official examination, but what you may have secured prior to our arrival." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Dr. Washington seemed trustworthy, but I'd learned today that official credentials didn't necessarily indicate true allegiance. "Judge Martinez vouched for Dr. Washington personally," Mike said quietly, reading my hesitation. "She's one of the few people in the state system who can't be bought or pressured by the Chesterfields." With that reassurance, I produced the documents. I'd hidden in my jacket the Chesterfield portfolio and the occupant ledger. "I took these when I realized someone was coming," I explained. "Something told me not to leave everything down there unprotected." Dr. Washington examined the documents with careful hands, her expression growing increasingly grave as she read through the portfolio. "This is dynamite," she said finally. Historical dynamite. These documents directly contradict the established narrative about Augustus Chesterfield's role in the Civil War. According to accepted history, he was a staunch Union supporter who sacrificed personal wealth to support the Northern cause. These records paint a completely different picture. "They're lies," a new voice interrupted. We turned to find Richard Chesterfield approaching, having apparently doubled back after his team's departure. "Forgeries created by enemies of my family. To tarnish our legacy," Dr. Washington calmly closed the portfolio. "That's a determination for historical experts to make after proper authentication, Mr. Chesterfield. Those documents were illegally removed from the site after you established official oversight," he countered, his genial mask completely gone now. "That constitutes tampering with historical evidence." "Actually," Mike interjected, "Mr. Merritt removed these items before any official claim was established, while the chamber was still simply a private discovery on his property. No laws were broken." Chesterfield's eyes narrowed. "This matter will be resolved appropriately, I assure you." He focused his attention on me. "Mr. Merritt, despite this unfortunate misunderstanding, my offer still stands. The Chesterfield Foundation is prepared to purchase any historical materials related to our family for a sum that would resolve your financial difficulties. It would be a shame to lose your family farm over a matter that could be so easily resolved." The threat beneath the offer was barely concealed. "Accept the money and surrender the documents, or face the consequences of challenging one of the state's most powerful families." "That won't be necessary," Dr. Washington said before I could respond. "Mr. Merritt's discovery falls under the Historical Site Emergency Preservation Act. As such, his property will receive protected status pending full evaluation of its historical significance." "Protected status?" I asked, not familiar with the term. "It means foreclosure proceedings are automatically stayed for up to 120 days, while the historical value of the property is assessed," Mike explained, a slow smile spreading across his face. "The bank can't take any action against the property during that period." Richard Chesterfield's expression darkened. "That act is intended for landmarks and battlefields, not convenient tools for delinquent property owners to avoid their financial obligations. The language of the act covers any site containing historically significant artifacts or structures in imminent danger of destruction or damage due to development or transfer of ownership," Dr. Washington recited. "Mr. Merritt's property clearly qualifies. I've already initiated the paperwork. This was an unexpected lifeline, 4 months of protection from foreclosure, time to properly document the chamber's contents, and perhaps find a long-term solution for preserving both the historical materials and my family's farm." Chesterfield assessed the situation with cold calculation. "This is merely a delay, not a resolution. The Chesterfield Foundation will formally challenge this designation. In the meantime, we'll be petitioning for immediate access to any materials pertaining to our family history, particularly these alleged documents which require authentication. Follow the proper procedures, Mr. Chesterfield," Dr. Washington replied evenly. "Now, I believe you're still on Mr. Merritt's private property without his invitation." With a final glacial stare, Chesterfield turned and walked away, his rigid posture betraying his fury. We watched in silence until he disappeared around the corner of the barn. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Mr. Merritt," Dr. Washington observed. "The Chesterfields aren't accustomed to opposition, especially regarding their carefully constructed historical narrative." "Will the protected status hold up against their challenge?" I asked. She sighed. "For a while. They'll bring political pressure, certainly. Senator Harrison will likely become involved. But the initial protection gives us time to properly document everything. Once the historical record is established, it becomes much harder to suppress." Mike looked troubled. "They won't limit themselves to legal challenges. The Chesterfields didn't build their empire by playing fair." What does that mean? For Jack, Dr. Washington asked. It means we need to be concerned about more than just the legal battle, Mike replied grimly. The Chesterfields have been known to use less formal methods when their interests are threatened. Anonymous code violations reported against business, competitors, sudden tax audits, unexpected cancellations of insurance policies, even accidents that weren't entirely accidental, Dr. Washington nodded gravely. I'd recommend documenting everything in the chamber as quickly as possible. Create multiple secure copies of all materials. And, Mr. Merritt, she fixed me with a serious look. Don't go anywhere alone for the foreseeable future. As the sun began to set over my farm, I felt the weight of what I'd discovered transforming from historical curiosity to genuine danger. In less than 12 hours, I'd gone from a farmer facing foreclosure to the custodian of explosive historical secrets that threatened one of the state's most powerful families. The temporary reprieve from foreclosure should have been cause for celebration, but instead it felt like merely the opening move in a dangerous game whose rules I didn't fully understand. As Dr. Washington continued explaining the protection process, I found myself glancing toward the ridge where the chamber lay, wondering if my ancestor had anticipated the storm his preserved truths would unleash generations after his death. The chamber had been sealed for over 150 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. Now that it was open, there would be no going back, for the historical record, for the Chesterfield legacy, or for me and my farm. We had all been irrevocably changed by what lay buried beneath the soil my family had worked for 6 generations. The next morning dawned with a surreal quality. I woke to find 2 state police officers still stationed near the chamber, the official preservation team setting up equipment in my east field, and my quiet farm transformed into a hub of activity. News of my discovery hadn't yet reached the media, but it seemed only a matter of time before journalists would join the growing crowd on my property. Dr. Washington had arranged for a portable office trailer to be delivered, establishing it as the headquarters for the documentation project. As I approached with coffee in hand, I could see her through the window, already engaged in an animated phone conversation. Her expression suggested it wasn't going well. The Chesterfields haven't wasted any time, she said as I entered, hanging up with a frustrated sigh. Senator Harrison is already applying pressure to have their foundation named as the primary research partner for the site. He's implying that my decision to exclude them shows concerning bias against a respected state institution. Can he force you to include them? I asked, setting down a cup of coffee for her. Not directly, but he controls our department's budget. She accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. Unfortunately for him, I'm 3 years from retirement with a full pension already secured, so his financial threats don't carry much weight with me personally. But they could affect the department. Yes, which puts my director in a difficult position. She took a sip of coffee and grimaced slightly at its strength. However, we have protocols for historically sensitive discoveries that require certain standards of objectivity. The Chesterfield Foundation's clear conflict of interest gives us legitimate grounds to limit their involvement. Before we could discuss further, a silver sedan I didn't recognize pulled up beside my barn. A tall black woman in her 60s emerged, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. She carried herself with the confident precision I associated with career military, though she was dressed in civilian clothes, khakis and a crisp button-down shirt under a lightweight jacket. "Dr. Washington," she called, approaching the trailer, with a purposeful stride. "I came as soon as I received your message." Dr. Washington's face broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. "Professor Carter, thank you for responding so quickly." She turned to me. "Mr. Merritt, this is Dr. Elaine Carter, Professor Emeritus of Civil War History at the University and former curator of the State Historical Museum." If anyone can help us properly contextualize what you've discovered, it's her. Professor Carter extended her hand, her grip firm and direct. Mr. Merritt, Abigail tells me you've quite literally unearthed a historical treasure. Apparently so, I replied, somewhat intimidated by her commanding presence, though I'm still coming to terms with exactly what that means. It means you're sitting on historical dynamite, she said frankly. Abigail sent me photographs of some of the materials. Last night, if authentic, and I have no reason to doubt they are, several of those documents will fundamentally alter our understanding of Missouri's Civil War experience. Dr. Washington nodded toward the window, where we could see another vehicle approaching, a news van with a satellite dish mounted on top. And it appears the media has arrived. We should continue this conversation inside. Once settled in the cramped trailer office, Professor Carter got straight to business. Mr. Merritt, before we discuss the historical implications, I need to understand your personal stake in this discovery. What do you hope will come from all this? The directness of her question caught me off guard. Honestly, initially I was just hoping to find something valuable enough to help save my farm from foreclosure. Now, I'm not sure what to hope for. The Chesterfields have made it clear they'll fight to suppress anything that contradicts their family narrative. Professor Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. And you're caught in the middle, between historical truth and a powerful family determined to protect their legacy. Exactly. Though the protected status buys me some time, it doesn't solve the underlying problem. In 4 months, I'll still be facing foreclosure unless something changes. She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. Let me tell you something about the Chesterfields that might not be in those documents you found. For 3 decades, I attempted to research Augustus Chesterfield's Civil War activities. For my doctoral dissertation, every time I made progress, I encountered obstacles, records mysteriously missing from archives, interview subjects suddenly unwilling to speak with me, research funding unexpectedly cancelled. They blocked your research? Dr. Washington asked, sounding surprised. Systematically, Professor Carter confirmed. Eventually, I was advised by my department chair to choose another dissertation topic if I wanted to graduate. The message was clear. The Chesterfield history was not to be scrutinized too closely. But why? I asked. I understand they want to protect their reputation, but going to such lengths over events from 150 years ago seems extreme. Because history shapes the present, she replied, leaning forward intently. The Chesterfield fortune and influence rest on their carefully constructed narrative of patriotic sacrifice and principled entrepreneurship during the Civil War. Augustus Chesterfield is celebrated in our state history as a visionary who supported the Union cause at great personal cost, then rebuilt the region's economy during Reconstruction through sheer determination and business acumen. When in reality, according to those documents, Dr. Washington interjected, he was playing both sides for profit and building his fortune through government fraud and black market activities. Precisely, Professor Carter nodded. If that narrative crumbles, it doesn't just tarnish their ancestors' legacy, it calls into question the very foundation of their current wealth and status. The Chesterfield political and business empire is built on historical mythology. Your discovery threatens to replace that myth with documented reality. I ran a hand over my face, the weight of the situation settling more heavily on my shoulders. So, I've not only discovered historically significant artifacts, I've stumbled into a century-long cover-up by one of the most powerful families in the state. That's an accurate assessment, Professor Carter agreed, which is why I'm here. Abigail knows I've been waiting decades for definitive evidence of Augustus Chesterfield's true wartime activities. Your discovery may finally provide what I've been searching for. Dr. Washington smiled slightly. I thought you two might find common cause. Professor Carter turned to me with newfound intensity. "Mr. Merritt, I believe we can help each other. You need to navigate a historical minefield while saving your farm. I need access to documents that could complete my life's work. Together, with Abigail's official oversight, we might be able to achieve both objectives while ensuring historical truth isn't buried again." "How?" I asked, desperate for a concrete plan. "First, we document everything meticulously," she explained. "Multiple copies stored in multiple secure locations. The Chesterfields will attempt to challenge the authenticity of anything that contradicts their narrative, so we need irrefutable authentication. I've already arranged for the state's top preservation specialist to begin that process today," Dr. Washington confirmed. "Second," Professor Carter continued, "we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. I'd like to conduct a preliminary review of all materials relating to the Chesterfields, with your permission. The more we know, the better we can anticipate their countermoves." "Of course," I agreed. "Third, we need to consider your personal safety and the security of your property." Her expression grew grave. The Chesterfields didn't maintain their secrets for generations by being gentle with those who threatened to expose them. Mike Lawson, my neighbor and attorney, said something similar, I acknowledged. "Your attorney friend is wise. The Chesterfields operate through layers of deniable intermediaries, but make no mistake, they play for keeps." Before I could respond, a knock at the trailer door interrupted us. A young preservation team member entered, looking slightly apologetic. "Dr. Washington, we've begun cataloging the chamber contents, but there's something you should see immediately." We followed him across the field to where the chamber entrance had been secured with a proper temporary structure. Inside, the preservation team had established lighting and were carefully photographing and tagging items. In one corner, they had uncovered something that hadn't been visible during my initial exploration. A small metal box embedded in the wall, revealed only after carefully moving the printing press. "We detected it with the thermal scanner," the team leader explained. "It's giving different temperature readings than the surrounding wall, suggesting a hollow space." The box was made of iron, approximately 1 foot square, with no visible hinges or lock, just a simple dial on the front with letters rather than numbers. "A combination safe," Professor Carter observed, kneeling to examine it closely. "Civil, war era, but sophisticated for its time. Your ancestor was thorough in protecting whatever's inside." "Any ideas about the combination?" Dr. Washington asked me. I shook my head. "Nothing specific, though my great-grandmother's journal might contain clues. Samuel seems to have left instructions for various aspects of the chamber." Professor Carter studied the dial thoughtfully. "Most combination safes from this period used words rather than number sequences. Something meaningful to the owner, typically 5 to 8 letters." As we pondered the possible combination, another team member approached with an update from the surface. "Dr. Washington, there are several news crews at the property entrance. They're requesting statements about the discovery. Also, someone from the governor's office has arrived and is asking to speak with you." Dr. Washington sighed. "The Chesterfields have escalated to the executive branch now. We need to move quickly." She turned to me. "Mr. Merritt, work with Professor Carter on identifying potential combinations for the safe. Whatever's inside, Samuel Merritt thought it important enough to secure beyond the chamber itself. That suggests it may be the most crucial evidence of all." As Dr. Washington departed to handle the growing crowd above, Professor Carter and I returned our attention to the safe. "Your ancestor went to extraordinary lengths to preserve the truth," she observed. "He built a chamber that remained undiscovered for over 150 years, catalogued and preserved materials that documented a counter-narrative to official history, and then created this additional layer of security for what must be the most sensitive items of all. He was protecting his family, I said, understanding dawning. These truths would have been dangerous to reveal during his lifetime, maybe even for generations afterward. And they remain dangerous today, Professor Carter agreed. But perhaps the time has finally come for them to see the light. Your financial crisis, the Chesterfield's ongoing influence, your discovery of the chamber, these events converging now might not be mere coincidence. You think there's some greater purpose to the timing? I asked, surprised by the suggestion from someone I'd perceived as purely academic. She smiled slightly. I'm a historian, Mr. Merritt. I've studied enough of humanity's story to recognize that sometimes the moment and the messenger align in ways that defy simple explanation. Your ancestor preserved these truths until they were needed. Perhaps they're needed now. As I stared at the mysterious safe, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. I wasn't just fighting for my farm anymore. I was becoming the custodian of a truth that had waited generations to be revealed. Whatever was sealed inside that metal box might not just change history, it might change the future as well. And somewhere, in my great-grandmother's journal, lay the key to unlocking it all. 3 days of intensive work transformed our understanding of the chamber and its contents. Professor Carter proved invaluable, her decades of research providing context for each document we uncovered. Under her guidance, the preservation team meticulously catalogued over 500 distinct items, from military artifacts to personal letters, each piece adding depth to the extraordinary story of my ancestors' clandestine activities during the Civil War. The media frenzy grew daily. News vans lined my driveway, reporters called constantly, and historical societies from across the country requested access. Through it all, Dr. Washington maintained strict protocols, ensuring that nothing left the site without proper documentation. Our most significant breakthrough came on the morning of the 4th day. While reviewing my great-grandmother's journal, for the 3rd time, I noticed a passage I'd overlooked. Grandfather told me today that truth is the only sanctuary that never fails. He made me repeat it until I wouldn't forget. Sanctuary, Professor Carter said when I showed her, that could be our combination. We hurried to the chamber, where the preservation team had been working to decipher the safe's mechanism. When they dialed in SANCTUARY, the lock released with a satisfying click. Inside lay a single leather portfolio and a daguerreotype photograph in a silver frame. The image showed a stern-faced man in a Union Army colonel's uniform, immediately recognizable as Augustus Chesterfield from historical photographs. But unlike his official portraits, this one showed him standing beside a Confederate officer, both men smiling and clasping hands. Written on the back in faded ink, the arrangement, sealed May 1863, The portfolio contained the most explosive evidence yet, original letters between Augustus Chesterfield and Confederate authorities arranging for the deliberate sabotage of Union supply lines, lines his own company had been paid handsomely to secure. More damning still were ledgers documenting payments received from both governments for services rendered, alongside records of his private arms dealing to both sides. Most shocking was a detailed confession written by a junior officer who had served under Chesterfield, describing how the colonel had orchestrated an attack on a civilian settlement, blaming it on Confederate guerrillas to justify harsh retribution against Southern sympathizers whose land he later acquired at pennies on the dollar. This isn't just historical revision, Professor Carter said, her voice hushed as she examined the documents. These are records of war crimes and treason, carefully concealed for generations. The foundation of the Chesterfield fortune, I added, built on betrayal and the blood of innocent people. News of our discovery traveled fast. By noon, we received word that the governor himself was dispatching additional state police to secure the site, Professor Carter arranged for digital copies of all documents to be transmitted to trusted colleagues at 3 different universities, ensuring the evidence couldn't be easily suppressed. The Chesterfields' response was swift and multi-pronged. By mid-afternoon, their lawyers had filed for an emergency injunction to halt all work, claiming the materials were defamatory forgeries and their examination constituted invasion of privacy. Simultaneously, a whisper campaign began questioning the professional credentials of both Dr. Washington and Professor Carter in historical circles. More concerning were the personal attacks. My bank suddenly discovered irregularities in my mortgage, requiring immediate review. The county health department received an anonymous complaint about my well water, necessitating tests that temporarily cut off my water supply. My insurance company notified me of a policy audit that froze my coverage. Classic Chesterfield tactics, Professor Carter observed grimly. They're trying to make your life difficult enough that surrendering the document seems like the easier option. But the Chesterfields had underestimated the power of the story we'd uncovered. The historical community rallied around us, with prominent scholars publicly vouching for the authenticity of our findings. Local farmers, many facing similar pressure from development companies, began showing up with food, water, and offers of assistance. A crowdfunding campaign launched by a local history teacher raised enough to cover my mortgage payments for the next 3 months. The governor, sensing the shifting political winds, issued a statement supporting the proper historical examination of all materials, regardless of which prominent families they might concern. The State Historical Society formally designated the chamber and surrounding 5 acres as a protected historical site, ensuring it couldn't be disturbed even after foreclosure proceedings resumed. The turning point came exactly 1 week after our discovery. The national press picked up the story, framing it as David versus Goliath, a struggling farmer uncovering historical truth against the wishes of a powerful dynasty. When 3 respected universities simultaneously announced their authentication of the documents, public opinion solidified on our side. Richard Chesterfield made one final attempt to resolve the situation privately. He arrived unannounced one evening, his usual entourage conspicuously absent. "Mr. Merritt," he began, his voice lacking its usual confidence, "I'd like to propose a compromise. The Chesterfield Foundation will purchase your entire property at triple market value, with the understanding that you'll sign confidentiality agreements regarding certain sensitive materials." "It's not my history to sell," I replied. "These aren't just documents about your family, they're about all the people affected by your ancestors' actions. Their descendants deserve the truth too." "You're making a mistake," he said, mask slipping to reveal genuine anger. "The Chesterfields have long memories. So does history," I countered. "That's the point." After he left, Professor Carter placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. "You've done something remarkable here, Jackson. Not just discovering these materials, but choosing truth over personal gain." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we tell the story properly," she replied. "The State Historical Society is establishing a permanent research center around the chamber. They've offered you a position as site manager with housing rights on the property. Your farm may change, but it will remain your home and your family's legacy will be preserved alongside the historical record. As the sun set over my land, I thought about my ancestor Samuel Merritt, who had preserved these truths at great personal risk. He hadn't lived to see them revealed, but he'd trusted that someday, when the moment was right, someone would uncover the chamber and let history speak for itself. That trust had spanned 6 generations to reach me. Through chance, necessity, and perhaps something more, I'd become the caretaker of a truth that had waited 150 years to be told. My family's connection to this land would continue, transformed but unbroken, just as the historical record would. Continue, amended but strengthened by the uncomfortable truths we'd unearthed. Some secrets, it seems, are buried not to be forgotten, but to be discovered when the world is finally ready to hear them.